Hey, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan Rohrer. I'm in San Francisco at Grace Lutheran, www.gracesf.com, and we worship every Sunday at 10:30. In Oregon, we have
Pastor Amanda Zensalo. I serve at Central Lutheran Church in Northeast Portland, Oregon. Our worship service is at 10:15 on Sunday mornings, and you can learn more about us at www.centralportland.org. And over in, am I accurate when I
Colorado?
In Colorado. See, I was going to say Denver, but that's not right either. Over in Colorado.
I am not in Denver. My name is Pastor Daniel Tisdale. I'm in Gypsum, Colorado, which is sort of in the mountains, halfway between Denver and Utah, near Vail. And we have worship at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, and our web page and Facebook page is First Lutheran of Gypsum. That's all one word. And come out and check us out.
And you might notice that my office looks a little different today. It's because we got carpet installed and everything in here had to go out and then come back. And my grandmother, not my grandmother that I speak of a lot, who lives in Clark, South Dakota, but my grandmother, Leona, who passed away when I was younger, was 4th of July and married on the 4th of July. And she was a part of the VFW, and her job in the VFW was to take all the flags that were kind of getting older and had seen their days, or maybe were getting a little like worn on the ends, and she would either sew them and fix them, or they would give them like a ceremonial discontinuation ceremony. And so there's something inside of me that when I see a flag that someone has put on the floor and rolled up, it bugs the heebie-jeebies out of me. And so there's a flag in my planter behind me. Until it can find a proper home, it's going to go there because it can't touch the floor. And, you know, God bless America, 4th of July just happened. These little red bits here that are kind of loop-de-doops, Pastor Dan was asking me about earlier, and I don't think I have shared with anyone what they're from. They're from Indonesia, and they're usually in a much larger form. They might be made out of wheat, or they might be made out of a canvas. Is the shape that would happen when you are planting your crops, and it helps to bring harvest and abundance. And so I have them in my office in hopes that they help to be good stewards and encouragers of attitudes of abundance in our congregation. So that's what's going on behind me. And some of the plants passed away because we had to have a humidifier on when my office window was being repaired after 30 years of constant leaking in this office, which also explains the carpet being replaced. And so we've got some new little clippings trying to make their way. And so some of them are bigger than others. And so they're having a fun time kind of regrowing. So that's what's going on behind me. In this week's lectionary text, there are some pretty fun readings. If you are a snarky person, or if you are someone who every once in a while has a bit of a toddler-like outburst, I'm not going to say that you might be able to see toddler-like outbursts on CNN pretty regularly, or who they might be coming from, but you can imagine some of those antics being read in our readings. In the Matthew text, Jesus is talking about people, and faithful people in particular, being like small children who fight in a marketplace, with phrases such as, "We played the lute for you and you wouldn't dance," which is one that makes me super happy. The Romans text, I think, is probably one that everyone in the world can imagine, when you not only are cranky, but you're cranky with yourself. "I don't understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want. I do everything I hate." Meh, right? And so they're essentially a grouping of texts that are talking about how do we make sense of a complicated world? How do we make sense of the fact that if God is in charge, and there's a lot of texts in the Bible talking about God choosing kings and God choosing leaders. That doesn't mean that all the leaders were great. There's a whole big section of the Hebrew Bible where they're like, and this king was crap. You know how crap he was? He did blah-de-da-de-da-de-doo-de-doo, right? And so there is an idea that God brings kings and brings leaders, but that doesn't mean they're going to be good at all. which begs the question, why in the heck, if God was going to create a world, would God create this world, create it in a way that makes us crabby a lot, right? Not have there be more immediate accountability. Why isn't there good consequences always for people who are good? Why do good things happen to people who are bad? Why can people who are leaders throw tantrums? And will our president keep tweeting, wait, that's not in the Bible? So, but I think these are all things that probably most people might think about, regardless of which side of politics you're on. Whomever you think are the people who are maybe not acting in accordance with what you think is good or what you think is just. It's an interesting conversation to think about. Why would God have a world that bugs us, right? Pastor Dan, what do you think? I like to lob Pastor Dan the tough ones.
I tend to try to find even though I preach on the gospel, I tend to try to find sort of the theme that runs through the texts. Try to see why the people that made up the Common Lectionary put these things together. And I think there's a little bit of it's an interesting week, because I think there's this idea that the world is sometimes a tough place, and sometimes we do things or we do things that we don't necessarily want to do, and we see things we don't think are good. And how do we reconcile that with doing justice, seeing justice in the world, and still feeling like, even though we're not always perfect, that we're still loved. So it's as someone who's early in my my preparation for preaching, it's I'm still sort of trying to grasp onto is headed this week, I think. A few weeks ago, I had one of the most difficult texts that I've ever had for preaching, when I've not come to bring peace but a sword, and I really struggled with that gospel, and even with the other readings. And then this week, it's not the same in terms of that. It's not like I'm having this sort of internal struggle, but it is sort of a struggle to find, and it tends to magically through the Holy Spirit happen, but to try to find that what is the gospel here, and what do people, including myself, what do I need to hear out of these texts, I guess. So and that probably didn't answer any question. I was probably just
well played, Pastor Dan. I think part of the reason I'm thinking about this is that last weekend I was at California Lutheran University, and at the Western States Youth Gathering, which, if you don't know what that is, it's like, imagine TED Talks for young people, where it's like hip and cool as like bishops can be when they speak on stage, right? So there's like cool bands, and there's like amazing slideshows, and it's like as cool as like a rock show would be. And then it's like, and we're having church, right? So it was like a fun, exciting event, and kind of cool to be leading communion and doing worship for 600 youth, because that's not something that happens very often for a lot of pastors. And that morning when I woke up to like get ready and get pumped up, and I got all of these Facebook messages that there was a pastor on Fox News who was doing like a TV show. And I don't know if it was like a I paid for this time and so I can say whatever I want kind of show. Cause I didn't see it. I just heard about it and saw screenshots about it, but it was like a Bible study with a pastor, someone who called themselves a pastor, who was like doing this show. And a member of my extended family, the reason they started watching it is like, you know how like on a Sunday morning you're flipping through and there's not really much on, so you might settle for something that you wouldn't normally watch, right? So, but it was like good enough to watch that morning because the person mentioned me. And so they were like, what's going on? And so I don't know how far across Fox, if this is like a Fox syndicated show or whatever it is, but it was somebody who was like talking about how they thought I was terrible and I don't know. I didn't hear it, so I don't really know what they said, but it wasn't good. It wasn't good. They weren't a fan. And so I Googled them. I went online and I Googled them and I typed in the name of their show, which I won't tell you because ratings sometimes is translated into approval and encourages people who are up to grumpy things. So I put into Google the name of their show and my name. And what came up was a page about how this person knew that they were gay, but was choosing to be celibate because they knew that God hated that about them. And I didn't even read anything. That was like the first sentence of the page that came up. And so I didn't read a single other thing on the page because I didn't need to know what they were saying about me. I could guess, right? But what I knew from that one sentence is that this person had so much self-inflicted pain, almost exactly like Paul does in this reading from Romans. Like, I always am doing the thing that I hate. I can't stop myself. That knowing the amount of like internal pain and suffering that this person was in made me not need to like defend myself or like care or hold on to any animosity because they were like saying bad things about me. And instead, I just felt kind of like sad for them and wanted to pray for their own care and to hope that they could experience freedom and love, the kind that happens at the of the book of Romans, right? And the reason I've been thinking about that is because I think so often, and there's a lot of scientific studies that show this, is the people who are the maddest about something are typically the ones who are doing that thing. And they're mad at themselves about it, so they get mad at everyone else in the world because they're mad at themselves about this one particular thing. And we find that throughout Scripture. And we find that throughout faith communities, that there are people who get really mad about one particular thing, and it's because they're very mad at themselves about that. And so much of the like strangeness of our world and our interacting with each other is based on like all these weird ways that we are judging ourselves and we're judging other people, and we don't even know how to interact with people. And the best way I can kind of like put it into like a metaphor that would be explainable would be to think about one of the first times in your life you ever went to a public shower where there were no curtains. So like naked bodies were going to be there and you had to get naked, and you had like, maybe you had waited a couple days to like take a shower. You were like, I can get dirty for a couple days, but it was like beyond when you could not take a shower anymore. Maybe it's at a gym. And aside from the one person who's like la 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 traipsing around and will be naked even longer than in that shower experience, most people are trying all kinds of convoluted things so that you won't see their naked body. Because most people in that circumstance are worried that other people are going to have the same judgments about our bodies that we carry for ourselves. And so if you've ever had a towel that was too tiny at a gym, you know what I'm talking about. But the reality is, in that situation, if everybody is so consumed with worrying about what other people will think about them, no one actually has the time to be judgy in that moment. Right? In a public shower where everyone's towel is too tiny, you don't have time to actually think the thoughts that you're so afraid everyone's thinking about you. And so it's a lot of like wasted, grumpy energy. That doesn't mean that like there's like a magical formula somewhere that helps us all have like good self-esteem, nor maybe should we all traipse around in a shower like that, because it's a slippery place and going slow means you don't fall on your head. But I wonder how much of our faith life together, how much of our time in church spaces, how much of our time when we're having conversations or they're not having conversations, when there's 4 boxes of heads on a news show and they're all just screaming but not listening to each other, how much of our world is like that shower with a too small towel, right? Where we're so concerned about what's going on for us that we don't have the ability to think about other people. And perhaps this is a uniquely Lutheran metaphor because our understanding of what forgiveness and what grace means is that God forgives us not because we deserve it, but so that we can get over our own shame and guilt and doubt that is preventing us to be kind to other people. And the idea is that we are robed in Christ, right? God covers us with a giant beach towel so that we don't think about our own fear and shame and doubt about ourselves. Earth in the world with boldness and kindness and get beach towels for everybody else. I don't know. That's kind of what I think about. But then how do you like make the world better, and how do you do justice, and how do you like feeding stomachs is so much more important than my particular body image in a shower stall. And so how do we do what is right and keep the world moving forward? Pastor Amanda has something to say. I can tell by the look on her face.
Oh, I'm just active listening in video form. But I think I think that there's a
Hi, Annabelle, by the way.
This is Annabelle. She says hello. She's kind of snuggly and quiet today, which is sweet. Where you were going with kind of that self-hatred, self-flagellation, self-beat up, those kinds of pieces. One of the things that I was thinking about is how when we start being trained in pastoral care and counseling, one of the first things that they do is teach us to know more things about ourselves, so that when we start projecting onto other people, we actually are paying attention to that instead of like just assuming it's the other person that's pissing us off. So there's a side of like the person who pisses you off the most in your life is probably the person, like the things about them that are making you angry are probably the things about yourself that you are the most frustrated with. And I know in my first call, there was one person who, I mean, there were things about this individual that just drove me up the wall. And it wasn't until I started kind of going back to those very preliminary lessons about like, okay, if someone is doing something that makes you angry, then how is that actually more about you than about them? And yeah, the things that this person was displaying were exactly the things that I feel shame about in the way that I behave. And so it was really easy to just project onto her. I've been trying to keep that gender neutral. Bummer. I will say that I did over time begin to have a very positive relationship with that individual, but it took a lot of work on my part. It wasn't about her. It was about me, and about me finding my own way through my stuff. So this reading in Romans, I think we can definitely go there with that, right? We can definitely go through some of that conversation about that frustration with self-hatred, that frustration with our own limitations and the things that we want to work on, the things that we are not happy with. And what I like about where Paul goes with this, at least at the end of the reading, it's kind of like a lament psalm where all of that like negativity, the I can't get it right, I never get it right, I'm just terrible, I'm awful, that kind of...
I better eat worms.
Right, I better eat worms, like all that lamenty kind of stuff. At least they kept the last verse in this reading there, because it at least points us to where we can go to move past or forward or through some of that stuff. And I think that's a big deal, until coming to an understanding that God made me good, and that I am loved by God no matter what. I think my own defensiveness, I think my own self-judgment held me back. And I'm not saying it doesn't still hold me back. It certainly still holds me back plenty. And I can more readily fall back into this promise that I am who God has called me to be and created to be who God has called me to be. And I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I'm good. And that's part of the promise of this faith that I think is really helpful. And that takes us into like that Matthew section where then we have, the ways in which we've gotten it wrong, and the ways that we screw it up, and the ways we don't accept the gifts from God, and the way that we throw our temper tantrums. And then there's the promise that God is still going to be there. And that's pretty awesome. That's awesome stuff. Mm-hmm. Dan, did you have something you want to say? I'm starting to get a migraine, and I'm starting to see really pretty flashy things. So I'm going to go grab some migraine medicine real quick, and I'll be right back.
I think that we tend to have I've actually heard people that are not Lutheran or even Lutheran say, you know, we have a guilt complex. You know, we're about making people feel guilty, and I don't agree with that assessment, but I do think that there's an element of being realistic about the world around us, both in the issues of that there's justice in the world, but also in our own shortcomings. You know, that something that I say a lot, and I hear other people in Lutheran churches say a lot, is we're not here in church because we think we're good. We're here because we know we're not. We're here because we know we have things about ourselves to work on. And I told the story on one of these before, about the book of Ecclesiastes. When I really sort of discovered the book of Ecclesiastes in seminary, I was in a class of people from a variety. I think we had 7 denominations in the class, and out of 12 people. And the only 2 people that liked the book were me and the other Lutheran in the class. And it was because for us, the book of Ecclesiastes is about, yeah, we're not perfect. And we have a lot of things that we could be better at, but that's not there's some liberation in knowing that you're not perfect. And there's some liberation once you know yourself and you know that you're not perfect. It's easier to do justice. It's easier to walk the walk of a disciple, because you know that we're all on this road together, and it's not about judging other people, and it's not about I'm better than you. No matter what, a lot of times Christians have this. They'll tell you they're about justice, but they're really about I'm gonna help those little people. I'm gonna help those people that are not as fortunate as me. And while that may be true, because there's such a thing as privilege in the world, there's an implied I'm better than you out of that. My own personal theology and what happens often in Lutheran church. I want to say that if you're not Lutheran, you're not right, but but there's this idea that even as pastors, we have our shortcoming. I like what you said, Amanda, about CPE, clinical pastoral education. Part of our education is learning about our own issues and how they affect how we relate to other people, and how it relates to everything that we do, our preaching and our pastoral care, and dealing with difficult people in our congregations and in our communities. And it's often more about us. And if we're aware about our stuff, our crap, it helps us be better servants.
Right.
And I think there's an element of this. I like the humanness of Paul, because Paul could sometimes be a bit of an ass. And
a bit, only a bit.
Yeah. And he could be full of himself. And there's an element in this Romans passage of, okay, I don't always do the things I want to do. I don't always do things that I'm proud of. In fact, I often do things that I'm not proud of. And I'm stating this openly, and by doing that, there's some personal revelation. You know, it makes me appreciate Paul a little bit more in some of the other things that he said, because he's willing to sort of humble himself, and I think there's a lesson in there for all of us, especially those of us that are ministering to other people. And I don't even mean that just as pastors. I mean, as Christians who are trying to be disciples. Finding our own humanity, realizing our own weaknesses helps us to love other people, and to remind other people that they're loved by God. If we think that we're perfect, and we think that by being a Christian we're checking off some kind of boxes, then I think we're limiting ourselves as human beings, as Christians, as disciples. I like that even if he doesn't do it very often, Paul sort of takes that humble path for a few minutes.
And I like that these texts, at least for one Sunday, are able to speak to anyone who feels like they have to be perfect or they can't go to church. And even in the Matthew text, like, I don't know if people notice this, but people thought Jesus was a drunk. The Matthew text says that people thought Jesus was a drunk. And so if people have called you names rightly or wrongly, if you are someone who has had to get sober, you know what happens and the kinds of behaviors that make people call someone a drunk. And so Jesus was not perfect. Jesus clearly was being called names by other people. I think the texts are written in such a way that they argue that the Son of God or the Son of Man, whichever of the phrases you want to use to talk about Jesus, that Jesus's crucifixion isn't fair, that he's crucified for political views and for inciting riots rather than because of like he didn't steal things or like do those kinds of bad things. But I don't think the text really weighs in about whether or not he was drunk or not. We know that he made really great wine after everyone was already so drunk that they wouldn't be able to taste how good the wine was. So maybe, right? But so I bring this up not to like probably in part because my idea of Jesus errs on the human side more than on the divine side. And I think if Jesus is able to make mistakes and still be the Son of God, then we get to make mistakes and still be the followers of God, right? The standard for a child that you have might be different than the standards you have for the next door neighbor or a friend of your child. And so if Jesus gets to screw up every once in a while, then we get to screw up every once in a while as well. And I kind of like the idea of a God who understands what it's like to have a hangover, because that kind of God knows that human bodies get crabby when they're not fed enough, when they're not hydrated enough, and can understand some of the nuances of our behavior. And maybe if that person's in charge of the judgment, they see things going differently than someone who is celibate and has been sober their entire life and has never cut their hair or had a fight, right? And so I like me a rough and tumbly, scruffy Jesus, because I think that helps the ways in which our unique diversities can be loved by God as well.
And even when he doesn't make a mistake, he's at this last part of the gospel reading, he's a little passive aggressive, which I kind of like. Like it's not necessarily a mistake, but it's sort of a human reaction. There were, he's speaking to these crowds, and wherever he went, there were leaders of the temple that were following around and trying to catch him in things. And
yeah. And does this?
I'm so thankful you haven't revealed yourself to the wise and intelligent, which is really kind of, like, oh, those are really good in this crowd that think of yourself as wise and intelligent, which is sort of a.
But can you imagine if a pastor ever did that at a council meeting? Don't worry, Jesus says the wise and intelligent never have the full revelation of God. No, right? You would not say that in front of other people unless you want to be punched in the face.
Right, exactly.
Well, one of the things I think that is helpful this last couple of weeks, I've been talking about this when in regard to Matthew, is that it's a tough gospel to walk a tightrope. It's like the tightrope gospel. Any minute that you think that you're hearing pure law, there's gospel like right over the other side of the tightrope. And anytime you're hearing pure gospel, there's always a little bit of law like right there. And it's really easy to
What's that mean, Pastor Amanda?
So good question, Pastor Megan. Thanks for asking. It's we'll see whether or not I can. There's like random sparkles everywhere, and I hope I'm looking at the camera. Y'all sound really good with my eyes closed, though. But the law is that part of the scripture that like convicts us and tells us, makes us feel like we suck. And the gospel is that part of our scripture that tells us that we are loved no matter what. And so the gospel of Matthew, I think personally, more than any of the other gospels, has this real law sound to it a lot of the times. Like you hear a lot of Judgy McJudgerpants in this. And it's really easy to like listen to Matthew and just hear about, I'm going to separate the sheep from the goats and the bad ones are going to burn in hell. Roar! Right? Like and if you didn't actually do the things that you're supposed to do, you're going to burn in hell. Roar! Right? Like,
nanner, nanner, nanner.
Right. It's all through Matthew. Right. But at the same time, if our faith does not bring us to do things, then we're not quite catching on to our faith. But we don't do things in order to earn God's love, right? It's this really, really hard thing. So sometimes I talk about it in this difference between we have to versus we get to. Mm. And with Matthew, it's really hard sometimes to see the difference. So we don't have to feed people in order to earn God's love. We've already earned it because of Jesus and what Jesus did, right? But we get to feed people and bring the kingdom of God one step closer every single day because we have God's love. And it seems like a minor distinction, but it's super, super critical. And in the Gospel of Matthew, it's super, super critical that we keep that in mind whenever we hear almost anything. And anytime in Matthew, I think that we hear only good news for ourselves, like, come to me, you who have heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. And I'm able to be like, yes, I have such heavy burdens. God, give me rest. Right? Like pure gospel, all for me. Then I need to like take a step back and say, okay, well, where's the law in that gospel? Because this is Matthew and that has to be there. And so understanding that my burdens are not the heaviest in this world, and that although I am tired and I want rest in God, that there are those who have heavier burdens than me. And it's my job to yoke myself alongside of them, and that together all of our burdens will be lighter. Right. And so that balance, it's really like a tightrope in the Gospel of Matthew. I talked a little bit more about that. I'm doing podcasts on like these kinds of differences between the four Gospels. And the first week was Mark and this week's was Matthew. So we can put a link for that if you're finding this at our justlutheran.blogspot.com page. We'll link it down below where you can check out we're not doing terribly long. It's like 20-minute babbles about each of these gospels and their flavors. And I think that's important to recognize about Matthew, especially in texts like this, and especially when we're talking about I am unworthy and I suck and God loves me, right? And that balance, which is coming out in both in our text this week.
I've been referred to you by Megan as a toddler pastor. I don't know if where I am. But this is the end of my third year of preaching every week on the lectionary. So I'm still in the first time preaching on some of these things, and I appreciate what you said, Amanda, because I loved the last 4 weeks on the mission discourse in Matthew, but I preach on it a lot because in my context, in a lot of people's context, there's a lot of, okay, I'm going to live my faith while I'm inside the church walls, and then I'm going to go home and do whatever the hell I want. And I think that happens a lot. But in my context, they've had 20 years of pastors or other people do everything for them. And so I said, there is something about, we are called to live our faith out in the world. And how do we do that? But I have had to be careful about, this isn't about your salvation. This isn't, you're still loved whether you do it or not. But there is also a calling. There is also about taking care of other people, and it can be in little ways, like the last week with just giving someone a drink of water. It can be preaching the gospel or whatever it is. I mean, like, we have to preach the gospel throughout our lives, and we can't just leave our faith at the door as we're walking out. So in my context, I've had to push that a little bit and challenge people, but then you have to figure out where's the balance of the law and gospel in that. I want to challenge people and push people, but I still want them to know that they're still loved whether they do it or not. And that, like you said, it's kind of a tightrope. It's kind of a really fine line to walk sometimes.
Yep. And that's why the truth of it is probably that most pastors are adolescent pastors where our voices crack and we have weird pimples. Right? I don't know if there's ever a pastor who develops into the adulthood stage, right?
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things I wanted to point out in the Matthew text, just because I don't know if we'll get another chance to do this for 3 years, because that's how long it takes for these texts to cycle, is let's have some body conversations. In addition to saying that they call Jesus a drunk, they also called Jesus a glutton. Now, that leads me to believe that the images of skinny Jesus that we have in paintings and on our crosses, at least according to the Gospel of Matthew, make zero sense, right? If he's getting called names based on how much he eats, think about the people in your life who you have heard made fun of because of how much they eat. They don't tend to be the skinniest people in the room. And so I want to open up the conversation that Jesus was maybe a little curvy, and perhaps curvier than others around him during the time, right? He probably had to walk from place to place, but during the latter end of the gospel, he wasn't doing so much walking. He was doing a lot of riding on boats. So, here's a shout out for curvy Jesus as opposed to emaciatedly skinny Jesus.
Glutton
and it's
drunkard.
Right? Yeah.
But
you can see the same.
They were fat shaming even back then, I guess.
Was that? They were trying to fat shame Jesus. And you see the same kind of Pastor Amanda recognizes this because I got it in Portland at one of her favorite places in the world. This is a Bodhisattva, which is a Buddha who waits to attain enlightenment until everyone can go too, which is kind of what Jesus was up to. Like, I ain't getting saved if not everybody can be saved. And the reason I show you this is to think about the different types of Buddhas that you've seen when you've eaten out, or when you've visited temples, or when you've gone around the space. So there's different iconography and images about Buddha. Some of the Buddhas are emaciated. You can see the ribs. It's like starving in the desert, meditating Buddha, right? And then there's other Buddhas that's Buddha of the future. Buddha of the future lives in a land of plenty and has a giant belly, right? And the idea is that when you go to a restaurant, you can rub that Buddha's belly. It's the Buddha that, like these little symbols up here, abundance in life, and kind of replicates that out in the world. And so we have images of super skinny Jesus and super skinny dying on the cross Jesus. That's fine. Let suffering Jesus look suffering, right? But we need artists out there. We need curvy, abundant Jesus to show us how the curvy abundance of God in our world can happen. There are a lot of goddess imageries that, like the Venus of Willendorf, that talk about abundance coming through the roundness and the sacredness of the world. There are some people who are working on the eco-reformation right now who are thinking about the earth and the planet and the creation being this abundant space and what that looks like. But if we only have images of skinny Jesus, that's not very fun. And if I can pull this drawer open real quick, I can grab the folder of Jesuses around the world. Let's see if it happens. Here it is. Found it.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's a project called The Christ We Share, and you can order it online. I think it's a Canadian group. And the idea is that there are really diverse ideas of what Jesus looks like around the world.
Pull over to her that way. There it is. That one.
There you go. All right, now I got to talk again so it's big. Okay, so there's really diverse ideas about what Jesus looks like throughout the world. But if the only image of what Jesus looks like that you've ever seen is one where Jesus is super skinny, then you need to think about if Caucasian culture is the only kind of imagery that you're having in your congregation.
Well,
and so this is just, yeah, so this is one of the times, this is, I like to think of it as like Snow White Jesus, right? When she sings to the birds. There's a lot of amazing iconography for Jesus that can give us different images and different ways of thinking about what's going on in our world. And depending upon the political issues that you're thinking about, depending upon, I like Happy Jesus. Happy Jesus doesn't get featured very often. When's the last time you saw a picture of Jesus and he looked like he was enjoying life? I don't like this one. It's creepy. It's creepy, grumpy, angry Jesus, right? But this is a great, some of them are actually framed on my wall. They have Krista, the Jesus that has breasts as well in the series, but it's over on the wall. Right? So there's lots of different images of what Jesus looks like, as I know.
Wow.
This one might come in handy these days. Yeah. So I encourage you to think about the images of Jesus that we have in our sacred spaces and in our worship life, and what that means for us as people, and what that means for our faith, because there are so many different images of what Jesus looks like that are talked about in the different biblical texts. But the one that we don't have is curvy Jesus. And so I want to encourage artists out there to make curvy Jesus, maybe drunk curvy Jesus based on Matthew. I don't know what it would look like.
At a feast, because Jesus
Feasting
feasted.
Jesus.
He ate a lot of food with a lot of people. The only thing he did more than eating with people was healing. Yeah. So top thing he does in the Gospels is healing. Next thing he does is eat food with people. So this is not coming out of nowhere, this idea of a drunkard and a glutton, and you would be drinking when you're eating. So like a Jesus at a big feast table with a great big glass of wine and a great big meal in front of him with a great big belly, yeah, totally reasonable.
I think Jesus recognized that, I think some of the best times that I feel most connected with people in my congregation or just friends is over a meal. You know, that it's sometimes hard to connect when you're standing in front of people or when you're, walking along the road, but when you're sitting down and sharing people, there's something else that's there. There's a different level of connection. And I think, that's the more personable Jesus. That's my Jesus, that sat down and really gets to know people, really shows his love for people, and that happens more easily when you're eating, and that's part of why communion is so important to me, because it really is about a meal. It's about a shared meal with people that love each other and with Christ at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's not, I think sometimes that's lost on people. But the meal element of the communion, the meal, is important.
Yeah. Particularly because we just had carpet installed, there were a couple of people on the council who were like, and now no food can ever be on it. And I was like, so much of what we do as a congregation involves food. If you say there can never be food on it, it means we can never have a worship service in this room. We can never have a soup supper in this room. We can never have a reception or a funeral in this room. We can, think of the number of things. Like, you basically are saying this section of the church will not be church, because so many of the things that we do are so interconnected with food.
I think one of my favorite things that Len Sweet in this program has said is that as soon as you put down new carpet in a church, even if it has to be a ceremonial rite, stain it. Like, even if you just do it like as a ceremony blessing or something, but stain the carpet immediately to get past that whole hang up about this has to be perfect because we just bought it and there are no stains on it. And we're Lutheran, right? So we can totally come up with some kind of way to do like a ceremonial stain on the carpet so that this will be our hospitality. And we're not going to try to make this a place that is perfect and ideal. We're going to recognize that things are going to go wrong here, and that's okay because it's built to serve. Right. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a great piece of advice for pastors and for church leaders to just understand that immediately with a new carpet, just stain it and get that out of the way so that no one's pretending that it's going to be perfect there, which does tie into our texts. It really does tie to our text today.
Yeah. Somehow, somewhere. No, it's true. Well, thank you everybody who came to. That's right. To Bible study that doesn't suck. We appreciate you sticking in there with us, and we're glad that we're getting back in the groove of things. We hope that your life is well, but if it's not, heck, the scriptures are with you this week, and don't forget that God loves you and names you and claims you no matter what, even when people lie to you and tell you it isn't so. So there. Bye.